The respiratory system lesson 5.2 review. So this is just going to be a quick review of all the things that we learned in 5.1 and then a quick quiz at the end. And of course, we'll take up the answers. So here are all the things that we learned in lesson 5.1 about the respiratory system. So of course, the respiratory system supplies oxygen and removes carbon dioxide, or what is known as cellular respiration. So when we break the respiratory system down into different components, because it is such a complex system, we get things like ventilation, which is us actually breathing, external respiration, internal respiration, and cellular respiration. So ventilation is essentially us inhaling and exhaling, and it allows the body to take in oxygen and dispose of carbon dioxide. And it's most common in things like mammals and amphibians and birds. External respiration is the exchange of gases across the respiratory surface between the air sacs or the alveoli and blood. Internal respiration, on the other hand, is the exchange of gases as well, but it's between the blood and the capillaries and the cells. And lastly, cellular respiration occurs at the cellular level, so the mitochondria, and it requires nutrients from the digestive system to take chemical energy and convert it. So now we can break it down into the parts of the respiratory system, which is the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the lungs, and then remember in the lungs, it breaks down from the bronchi into little tiny bronchioles, and then of course the little air sacs, which are the alveoli. And we talked a little bit about this before, but inhaling increases the volume and decreases the pressure in the thoracic cavity, and exhalation decreases the volume and increases the pressure in the thoracic cavity. And if you remember back to that diagram or that video that we looked at in lesson 5.1 of the lungs actually filling and then contracting, and that's all supported by the work of the diaphragm. Lung volumes, we talked about vital capacity, tidal volume, total lung capacity, expiratory volume, inspiratory volume, and residual volume. And all of those things are essentially how much the lungs can actually hold at a certain time and then how much they let go. And if you remember, the average times an adult breathes in a minute is 12 times. Then we talked a little bit about the respiratory surface, and if you remember, that's where gas exchange happens, that little thin layer of epithelial cells. And remember, it has to be kept moist. So an example that I like to use to remember this is when worms, their whole body is the respiratory surface. So that's why sometimes when it's raining outside, you see more worms out there, because they go up there to get their respiratory system nice and wet. And then a few last points, we learned about how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported through the blood. So a quick recap on this is oxygen binds to hemoglobin, and then it's given to the organs, and then through cellular respiration turn to carbon dioxide, and then through the alveoli turn into oxygen again. And the alveoli are kind of a key component there. And then finally, we just learned about some respiratory diseases or problems that might occur. We're just going to do a quick practice now on how we might label the respiratory system. So this little part up here, this just top part, is what's known as the larynx. And then, of course, this sort of tube here is known as the trachea. And then obviously these pink things here are the lungs. And then this part right over here, this sort of line coming out from the trachea, are the bronchi. And then the little branches off the bronchi, you'll see that's essentially this little blown up diagram here. But that's these branches down here are the bronchioles. And then the square is projecting out what might we see inside of there. And then we have the alveoli. And then one other key component is this sort of muscle part down here, this dark pink, and that is the diaphragm. And now we just have our quiz to end things off. So if you remember from our past lessons, we talked about most of this stuff. And then there's two short answer ones at the bottom. So the pharynx opens to it's the one at the top. And if you go back to our diagram, you can see that it actually opens to all of these little sections and tubes. The exchange of gases takes place in the, well, if you remember where things, when we talked about how oxygen turns into carbon dioxide, that little part that's so important is actually the alveoli. And then lastly, during which of the two respiratory processes does the diaphragm move down? And if you think all the way back to 5.1, we actually talked about that inspiration. So when you breathe in, the diaphragm actually moves down, allowing for air to come in. And then lastly, we just have 2 short answer questions. So I'll give you a bit of time to think about those, and then I'll show you the answers. Okay, so how are pressure and volume related? So remember, it's when you inhale, the pressure decreases and the volume increases, and when you exhale, volume decreases and pressure increases. The next one, why is breathing through your nose better than your mouth? So if you remember, we talked about those defense mechanisms. So things like cilia inside your nose can help filter out allergens. It can also boost your oxygen intake with humid air, because when you breathe through your mouth, it kind of gets dry and it's not as good for you because it can actually increase the risk of gum disease. And that's it. You guys have learned all there is to know about the respiratory system.